They told her Americans would burn her alive. But when Michiko Hayashi, a 23-year-old Japanese Imperial Army nurse, arrived at the women's internment camp in Arizona in July 1945, she expected torture, starvation, and death. What she did not expect was Private Daniel Mitchell, a farm boy from Iowa, who smiled when he handed her a blanket. And she certainly did not expect that 6 months later, she would watch him take a bullet meant for her, his blood staining the desert sand as he whispered words she would never forget. "You're okay. Good." Those were his last words, spoken not with hatred for the enemy he was protecting, not with regret for the choice he had made, but with relief. Relief that she was safe. Relief that his sacrifice had meant something. Private Daniel Mitchell could have stepped aside. He could have let the angry civilians have their revenge. No one would have blamed him. These were enemy prisoners, representatives of a nation that had killed thousands of Americans, that had killed his own brother. But he did not step aside. He stepped forward. And that choice, that impossible, heroic choice, would echo across decades and oceans, proving that humanity can transcend even the deepest hatred between nations. This is the story of an enemy who became a protector, of a prisoner who learned that hatred is a choice, of one moment of sacrifice that changed everything. It is a story most people have never heard, and once you hear it, you will never forget it. If this story grabs your attention, make sure to subscribe for more powerful World War II accounts that history almost forgot. What happens next will challenge everything you think you know about enemies, about mercy, and about what it truly means to be a hero. Who was Michiko Hayashi? To understand what happened in that Arizona desert, we must first understand who Michiko Hayashi was before the war made her a prisoner. She was born in a small village near Kyoto in 1922, the eldest child of a rice farmer father and a seamstress mother. Her childhood was filled with the smell of cherry blossoms in spring and the sound of temple bells echoing across the misty hills at dawn. The village was called Takamura. Fewer than 200 families lived there, their wooden houses clustered around a single dirt road that wound through the rice paddies toward the mountains. Everyone knew everyone. Children played in the same streams where their grandparents had played. Time moved slowly, measured by the rhythm of seasons rather than the ticking of clocks. Her father was a quiet man named Hiroshi. His hands were rough from decades of working the fields, calloused and cracked and permanently stained with earth. But those same rough hands were gentle when he lifted his daughter onto his shoulders to watch the summer festivals. Those same hands turned the pages of poetry books in the evenings, his voice soft as he read verses about mountains and rivers and the fleeting beauty of cherry blossoms. He believed in education. He believed that learning could lift a person beyond their circumstances, beyond the boundaries of a small village, beyond the limitations that poverty tried to impose. He saved coins in a jar hidden beneath the floorboards, adding a little each month, dreaming of sending his daughter to school in the city. Her mother was named Fumiko. She was the heart of the household, the quiet strength that held everything together. Her fingers moved with incredible precision as she sewed kimonos for the wealthier families in nearby towns. She taught Michiko to cook rice, so it was never too soft or too hard. She taught her to clean and organize and care for others before herself. She taught her that a woman's strength was not in her voice, but in her endurance. Michiko had one sibling, a younger brother named Kenji, born 5 years after her. He was a quiet boy who inherited their father's gentleness and their mother's patience. From the moment he could hold a brush, he loved to draw. Birds in flight, mountains shrouded in morning mist, the weathered faces of old farmers in the village market. He would show Michiko his sketchbooks when she came home from school, his eyes bright with hope, waiting for her approval. She would study each drawing carefully, pointing out the details she loved, telling him that someday his art would hang in galleries and museums. He would blush and shake his head and say she was exaggerating. But she believed it. She believed her brother had a gift that could take him far beyond their small village, far beyond the rice paddies and the temple bells, and the life their parents had known. Then tragedy struck. Her father died when Michiko was 10 years old. It happened during harvest season. The rice was heavy on the stalks, bending golden in the autumn sun. Hiroshi was loading bundles onto a wooden cart when the wheel slipped in the mud. The cart tipped. The weight of the harvest came down on him. They found him pinned beneath bundles of rice he had spent months growing. His legs were crushed. His breathing was shallow. Blood seeped into the earth he had worked his entire life. He lived for 3 days. Michiko sat by his bedside the whole time, holding his hand, listening to his labored breathing, watching his face grow pale and then gray. Her mother wept silently in the corner. Kenji, only 5 years old, did not understand what was happening. On the third night, her father opened his eyes and looked at Michiko. "Take care of them," he whispered. "Your mother, your brother. Promise me." "I promise," she said. Then his hand went limp in hers. His chest stopped moving. The candle by the window flickered and went out. She remembered standing at his funeral, holding her mother's trembling hand, watching the incense smoke rise into a gray sky. The temple bell rang 49 times, once for each day of mourning. The sound echoed across the hills and faded into silence that seemed to last forever. After that, everything changed. A daughter's promise. Her mother took on more sewing work after the funeral. Her eyes grew weak from endless hours of stitching by candlelight. Her fingers bled from the needle, tiny drops of red staining the white silk she was paid to make beautiful. But she never complained. She simply worked, day after day, week after week, so her children could eat and study and dream of futures beyond the farm that had killed their father. Michiko swore she would help. She woke before dawn to prepare breakfast. She walked 3 miles each way to school. Even in winter, when snow covered the mountain paths and the cold bit through her thin coat, she studied harder than anyone in her class, memorizing lessons by candlelight, determined to honor her father's dream of education. She earned marks high enough to qualify for nursing school in Tokyo. It was one of the few paths open to ambitious young women in pre-war Japan, a way to escape the village, a way to make her father's sacrifice mean something. The day she left for Tokyo, her mother pressed a small cloth bundle into her hands. Inside was money, years of savings, coins from the jar beneath the floorboards. "Your father saved this for you," her mother said. "He wanted you to have a future." Michiko wept as the train carried her away from everything she had known. She watched the rice paddies shrink in the distance. She watched the mountains fade into mist. She pressed her hand against the window and whispered a promise to the father who could no longer hear her. "I will make you proud." By 20, she was working in a hospital in Tokyo. She learned to save lives. She learned to dress wounds and monitor vital signs and comfort patients in their final moments. She was good at it. The doctors praised her skill. The patients asked for her by name. She believed she had found her purpose. Then the war came. The hell of Okinawa. In 1944, Michiko was conscripted into the military medical corps. She did not volunteer. No one asked her opinion. A letter arrived with official stamps, ordering her to report for duty. Refusal meant disgrace for her family. Refusal meant Kenji might be punished when his time came for conscription. So she went. She was sent to Okinawa, assigned to a field hospital that received the wounded from the front lines. The hospital was a converted school building on the outskirts of Naha. Its classrooms had been cleared of desks and filled with straw mats where soldiers lay waiting for treatment or waiting to die. What Michiko saw there would haunt her forever. Young men brought in with limbs torn off by artillery. Boys who looked younger than Kenji, 17 or 18 years old, calling for their mothers as they bled to death. The smell of blood and infection and gangrene that never left her clothes, her hair, her skin, no matter how many times she scrubbed. She worked 18-hour shifts, sometimes 20. Sometimes she lost track entirely, sleeping in brief moments between surgeries, waking to the sound of another ambulance arriving with more wounded. The hospital had never been designed for this. The staff had never been trained for this. Nothing in her nursing school education had prepared her for the reality of men whose bodies had been shattered by explosives. She learned to shut down her emotions to survive, to look at a dying soldier and see only a task to be completed, to hear screams and register only sound without meaning, to hold a severed limb and not think about the young man it had belonged to, the dreams he had harbored, the family waiting for him back home. She became a machine, a function, a pair of hands that stitched and bandaged and cleaned. By early 1945, the hospital had run out of almost everything. No bandages. They used torn uniforms instead. washing and reusing them until the fabric fell apart in their hands. No antiseptic. Infections spread through the wards like wildfire, killing men who might have survived their wounds. No morphine. They performed amputations with nothing but sake for anesthesia. 4 orderlies holding the patient down while he screamed. Michiko stopped counting how many men died under her hands. She stopped remembering their faces. She stopped reading the letters they asked her to send to their families, because reading those letters made her human again, and being human hurt too much. When the Americans landed on Okinawa in April 1945, the Japanese defense collapsed within weeks. The thunder of artillery grew closer each night. The ground shook. The walls cracked. Patients who could walk fled into the hills. Patients who could not walk lay in their beds and waited. The hospital was overrun on a morning in late May. Michiko was trying to evacuate a soldier with a chest wound when the Americans arrived. Young men in uniforms she had only seen in propaganda posters. They carried rifles. They shouted in a language she did not understand. She expected a bullet, expected torture, expected the monsters that Japanese propaganda had promised. Instead, an American medic knelt beside her patient and began treating his wounds, with supplies she had not seen in months, with skill and efficiency that matched her own, with hands that were gentle despite belonging to an enemy. She stared at him, unable to process what was happening. Then someone grabbed her arm and pulled her away. Processing, they called it, the beginning of her life as a prisoner. The voyage. The ship that carried her across the Pacific was called the USS Mercy. Michiko found bitter irony in the name. Mercy was not something she expected from Americans. Mercy was not something the propaganda had prepared her for. She spent most of the voyage below deck, surrounded by other prisoners, nurses and teachers and translators, women who had been caught in the machinery of war and ground up by it, women who shared her fear and confusion and shame. The ship rolled constantly on the waves. Many women were seasick, vomiting into buckets that overflowed before anyone could empty them. The smell was terrible. The heat was worse. At night, the women whispered stories in the darkness. Stories about American POW camps, torture chambers where prisoners were beaten for sport, medical facilities where doctors performed experiments on living subjects, mass graves in the desert where prisoners were worked to death and buried in unmarked pits. Michiko listened, but said nothing. She had already accepted death, had made peace with it during those final weeks on Okinawa, when survival seemed like too much to hope for. But something happened during the voyage that cracked the walls she had built around her heart. An American guard, a boy who looked barely 18, offered her an orange one afternoon. He held it out with a shy smile, saying something she could not understand. When she hesitated, afraid of a trick, he peeled it himself and placed the segments on a clean napkin. Then he walked away, without asking for anything in return, without mocking her, without any of the cruelty she had been taught to expect. Michiko stared at the orange for a long time. She could not remember the last time anyone had given her something simply to be kind. The nurses on Okinawa had shared what little they had, but that was survival. That was necessity. This was different. This was a gift from an enemy who had no reason to be generous. She ate the orange slowly, savoring each burst of sweetness. Tears ran down her face as she chewed. Not tears of sadness, tears of confusion. The propaganda had promised monsters, but this boy with his shy smile was not a monster. The walls cracked, just a little, just enough to let doubt seep through. Camp Harris, Arizona. The train car smelled of sweat and fear and engine smoke. Through the gaps in the metal walls, Michiko could see the Arizona desert stretching toward distant mountains, brown and flat and endless. So different from the green islands where she had tended wounded soldiers. So different from her village near Kyoto, with its rice paddies and cherry trees. The sky was enormous, blue and empty, and stretching to every horizon. She had never seen so much sky. In Japan, mountains always interrupted the view. Here, there was nothing but space. The train slowed with a screech of brakes. The doors rolled open with a bang, and bright sunlight poured in, blinding after hours in darkness. Heat hit her like a wall, dry and burning. Nothing like the humid warmth of Okinawa. Michiko raised her hand to shield her eyes. Outside, American soldiers stood in formation. Guard towers rose against the impossibly blue sky. Barbed wire glinted in the afternoon sun. This was it, the place where her story would end. The camp spread before them in neat rows. Wooden barracks painted light brown. A large building with smoke rising from its chimney. An administration building flying the American flag with its strange stripes and stars. Everything was orderly, clean, military. Not the chaos and cruelty she had imagined. An American officer approached with a clipboard. He spoke in clear English, and a Japanese-American translator repeated his words. "You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be given food, shelter, and medical care. You will work light duties. Any attempt to escape will be met with force. Do you understand?" The women nodded in silence. Michiko did not trust these words. How could she? She had seen what war did to people. She had seen the cruelty that humans were capable of when given power over others. As they walked through the camp gate, she noticed the guards more closely. Young men, most of them, some barely old enough to shave. They watched the women with curiosity but not hatred. None spat, none cursed, none made threatening gestures. One guard in particular caught her eye. He stood near the entrance to a long building, leaning against a wooden post. Shorter than the others, with sandy brown hair that stuck out from under his cap. His face was covered in freckles. When he noticed Michiko looking at him, he did something completely unexpected. He smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile, just a simple, almost shy smile that seemed to say, "I know this is strange. I know you're scared, but it's going to be okay." Michiko quickly looked away. What kind of trick was this? Private Daniel Mitchell. His name was Daniel Mitchell. Everyone called him Danny, 21 years old, from a farm outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The eldest son of a corn farmer father and a schoolteacher mother who had read him poetry every night before bed. He had grown up surrounded by cornfields that stretched like golden oceans in autumn. He had learned to drive a tractor at 12, to milk cows at 8, to wake before dawn and work until his muscles ached. The farm had shaped him, made him strong and patient and accustomed to hard work. His mother was the dreamer in the family. She had studied literature at a small college before marrying his father. She kept shelves of books in the farmhouse, poetry and novels and histories that transported her beyond the endless fields. She read to Danny every night, filling his head with words and stories and possibilities. His father was practical. A man of few words and steady hands. He taught Danny that a man's worth was measured by his actions, not his speeches, by what he did when times were hard, by the choices he made when no one was watching. Danny had one sibling, a younger brother named Tommy, born when Danny was 3. From the first moment Danny held that squirming, crying bundle, he felt something click into place in his chest. A responsibility, a love so fierce it surprised him. They were inseparable growing up. Danny taught Tommy to fish in the creek behind their house, taught him to throw a baseball without hurting his shoulder, taught him to read before he started school so they could share the books their mother loved. Tommy had Danny's blue eyes but a gentler soul. He rescued injured birds and nursed them back to health in shoeboxes lined with cotton. He gave his lunch money to kids who had none. He believed in the basic goodness of people, even when the world proved otherwise. Danny volunteered for the army in 1943, believing he would be sent to Europe to fight Hitler. Instead, he was assigned to guard duty at stateside facilities, training bases, supply depots. Now this prisoner of war camp in the Arizona desert, he had never seen combat, never fired his rifle at another human being, spent the entire war watching others ship out while he stayed behind. Tommy enlisted the moment he turned 18, eager to prove himself. By February 1945, he was on a ship bound for the Philippines. By March, he was dead. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Danny's mother collapsed on the kitchen floor. His father sat at the table without speaking for 3 days. Danny read the telegram alone in the barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and cattle that had been the backdrop of his entire childhood. He wept until there were no tears left, until his throat was raw and his eyes were swollen and his heart felt like it had been scooped out of his chest. But there was something else. A letter that arrived 2 months later, forwarded through military channels, translated from Japanese by someone in the War Department. a letter that changed everything. Danny carried that letter in his breast pocket every single day. He had never shown it to anyone, never spoken of what it contained. But it was the reason he smiled at Japanese prisoners. It was the reason he could not hate. The first meal. The processing was efficient, but not cruel. Medical examination by a female doctor who spoke softly and touched carefully. Delousing powder applied with professional detachment. Then the showers. Michiko expected cold water, humiliation, the beginning of torture. Instead, hot water poured from the pipes. Real soap was placed in her hands, a thick white bar that smelled of lavender. She stood under the stream and felt something break inside her. Hot water. She had not felt hot water on her skin in over a year. On Okinawa, they had washed with rainwater collected in buckets, cold and dirty and never enough. But this water was hot, clean, endless. Tears mixed with the water running down her face. She wept silently, scrubbing away the dirt and grime of captivity, watching it swirl brown at her feet and disappear down the drain. When she emerged, new clothes were waiting. Not a prisoner uniform, simple civilian clothes, a cotton dress, undergarments, socks, canvas shoes. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her face was thinner than before the war, her cheekbones sharp, her eyes hollow, but her skin was clean. Her hair was damp and soft. She looked almost human again. Then came the mess hall. The smell hit her the moment she stepped inside. Rice cooking, vegetables, meat, coffee. Her mouth watered instantly, and her stomach cramped with hunger she had been trying to ignore for months. She picked up a metal tray with trembling hands. The first cook placed a large scoop of white rice on her tray. Real rice, steaming and perfectly cooked. Not the mixture of barley and weeds she had eaten in the final months of war. The second cook added vegetables, carrots, green beans, onions. The third added meat. Beef in thick brown gravy, then bread, soft rolls with butter, and a cup of hot coffee. Michiko stared at the tray. This was more food than she had seen in a single meal in over a year. She sat at a table with Mrs. Kimiko Sato, an older teacher from Tokyo, and two younger women. For a long moment, no one touched their food. "Is it poisoned?" one woman whispered. "No," Michiko said quietly. "Look, the Americans eat the same food. It comes from the same kitchen." She picked up her fork. Her hand trembled. She took a small bite of rice. The taste exploded in her mouth. Perfect, warm, delicious. She closed her eyes and chewed slowly, savoring it. Around her, the other women began to eat. Some cried silently as they chewed. Others ate mechanically, as if afraid to acknowledge what was happening. Then Mrs. Sato set down her fork. Her face crumpled. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. "My daughters," she said, her voice breaking. "My daughters in Tokyo are starving. The city is destroyed. They wrote me that they eat grass and tree bark, and here I sit eating beef and rice." The table fell silent. Everyone understood. They were prisoners, but they were being fed better than their own families back in Japan. Better than the soldiers they had tended on Okinawa. Better than anyone they had left behind. The shame of it was almost unbearable. Michiko forced herself to keep eating. Her body needed this food. Her survival depended on it. But each bite tasted of guilt. From across the room, she noticed the freckled guard from earlier. Danny Mitchell. He stood near the wall, watching the prisoners with an expression she could not read. When their eyes met, he gave a small nod. As if she were a person, not an enemy, not a monster, just a person. Everything she had been taught was wrong. The propaganda had promised demons. Instead, she had been given hot water and lavender soap and a meal that would have seemed like a feast even before the war. Why? The question echoed through her mind as she finished her food, as she was led to clean barracks with real beds, as she lay down on a mattress that felt like a cloud after months of sleeping on dirt and stone. Why were they being kind? She did not trust it, could not trust it, but deep inside, where the walls had cracked during the voyage, something small and fragile began to grow. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope. Hook for part 2. But the kindness was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Private Daniel Mitchell would appear wherever Michiko was working. He would bring her coffee. He would hold doors. He would smile that strange, gentle smile that made no sense coming from an enemy. And one evening, standing in the cold desert air, he would show her the letter he carried in his breast pocket. The letter from a Japanese nurse who had held his dying brother's hand on the other side of the world. A letter that would change everything. Because Tommy Mitchell, 18 years old, had died in the Philippines in February 1945. He had been wounded in an ambush, left for dead between the lines. A Japanese nurse had found him. She could have left him to die. Enemy soldier. No one would have blamed her. But she stayed with him for 3 days, changed his bandages, gave him water, held his hand when the pain got bad. And when he died, she wrote a letter to his family. That letter was why Danny Mitchell could not hate Japanese prisoners. That letter was why he smiled when he handed Michiko a blanket. And that letter was why, 6 months later, he would step between a bullet and the woman he had sworn to protect. Subscribe now, because what happens next will show you that kindness is not weakness, and that the choices we make in darkness define who we truly are. End of Part 1. T. Viet Tiep Part 2. Theodan Evoy Jo Dai 4002. Orchestrated narrative continuation with cinematic prose and strategic pacing elements. The user wants me to write Part 2 of the story. He stepped forward, following the outline I created earlier. Part 2 should be approximately 4,000 words in English. The rhythm of captivity. The days in the camp settled into a routine that felt both strange and comforting. Each morning a bell rang at 6. The women would wake in their bunks, blinking in the pale Arizona dawn, and for a moment Michiko would forget where she was. She would think she was back in the nurse's dormitory in Tokyo, or in the makeshift quarters on Okinawa, or even in her childhood room in the village near Kyoto. Then reality would return, the wooden walls of the barracks, the distant sound of American voices, the vast desert sky visible through windows that actually had glass in them. She was a prisoner, but she was alive. The women dressed quickly and made their beds with military precision. Old habits died hard. Even in captivity, the discipline drilled into them by years of war remained. Breakfast followed at 6:30 in the mess hall. Oatmeal or eggs, toast with jam or butter, coffee or tea. Always more food than Michiko had seen in the final year of the war. Always more than her family back in Japan was eating. That guilt never faded. Every meal tasted of shame. After breakfast came work assignments. The camp commandant, a stern man named Colonel Patterson, had made it clear that all prisoners would work. Idle hands bred trouble, he said, but the work was light by military standards. Nothing like the brutal labor that propaganda had promised. Some women worked in the camp kitchen, helping prepare meals. Others worked in the laundry, washing uniforms and linens. Still others tended a vegetable garden that supplied fresh produce for the camp. Tomatoes and beans and squash growing in neat rows under the Arizona sun. Michiko was assigned to the camp infirmary. When the medical staff learned she had been a nurse, they put her skills to use immediately. She would work under the supervision of the camp doctor, Captain William Harrison, treating minor injuries and illnesses among both prisoners and guards. The irony was not lost on her. 6 months ago, she had been treating Japanese soldiers wounded by American weapons. Now she was treating American soldiers who had cuts and colds and twisted ankles. The infirmary was a revelation. Clean floors that were mopped every day, walls painted white and free of mold, windows that let in natural light, and supplies. Bandages stacked in neat rows, bottles of antiseptic lined up on shelves. Medicines she had not seen since before the war. They even had morphine. Michiko stood in front of the medicine cabinet on her first day and felt tears prick her eyes. She thought of all the soldiers who had screamed in agony on Okinawa while she held them down for amputations. She thought of the young men who had begged her to make the pain stop, and all she could offer was a rag to bite down on. If only they had had this. If only they had had any of this. Captain Harrison noticed her staring. He was a thin, serious man in his late 40s. His hair was gray at the temples. His eyes held the tired wisdom of someone who had seen too much suffering. He had served as a medic in the First World War, he told her later, had patched up young men in the trenches of France while artillery shook the earth. War never changes, he said. Only the weapons get better at killing. He treated Michiko with professional respect from the first day. He explained procedures in simple English, speaking slowly and clearly so she could understand. He watched her work and nodded when she did things correctly. He corrected her gently when she made mistakes. "You are a good nurse," he told her after her first week. "Your training shows. Whoever taught you did well." The compliment caught her off guard. She bowed slightly, unsure how to respond. But it was not Captain Harrison who occupied her thoughts as the weeks passed. It was the freckled guard with the gentle smile. The small kindnesses. Private Daniel Mitchell seemed to appear wherever Michiko was working. At first she thought it was coincidence. The camp was not large. Guards rotated through various posts. It made sense that she would see the same faces repeatedly. But the pattern was too consistent to be random. When she worked in the infirmary, he was often stationed nearby. When she was assigned to help in the garden, he volunteered for the escort detail. When she walked between the barracks and the mess hall, she would catch glimpses of him watching from a distance. Not with the predatory gaze she had feared, not with hatred or contempt, with something that looked almost like concern. He would nod to her when their eyes met. Sometimes he would say good morning in English. Once he tried to say it in Japanese, Ohayo gozaimasu. But his pronunciation was so mangled, the syllables so twisted, that Michiko could not help but smile. It was the first time she had smiled since Okinawa. He noticed. His face lit up with a grin. "That bad, huh?" he said. "I'm trying to learn. Not very good at it, though." She did not understand all the words, but she understood the tone. Self-deprecating, friendly, disarming. Over the following weeks, small interactions accumulated like snowflakes forming a drift. Private Mitchell brought her coffee from the mess hall when she worked late in the infirmary. Real coffee, hot and strong, in a ceramic cup instead of the tin mugs the prisoners usually used. He would set it on the counter without a word, nod once, and leave. He held doors open for her, not in an exaggerated, mocking way, but naturally, as if it were simply what one did for another person. Once, when a sudden rainstorm hit and Michiko was caught between buildings, he jogged over with an umbrella and walked her to the barracks. He did not speak, did not try to make conversation, just held the umbrella over her head and matched his pace to hers. When they reached the barracks door, she turned to thank him. The rain was pouring down around them, drumming on the canvas of the umbrella, turning the desert dirt to mud. His uniform was soaked. Water dripped from the brim of his cap, but he was smiling. "Stay dry," he said. Then he turned and jogged back into the rain. Michiko stood in the doorway and watched him go. Her heart was beating strangely. Her thoughts were tangled and confused. These gestures made no sense. She was the enemy. She was a prisoner. Why would an American soldier care if she got wet in the rain? Why would he bring her coffee? Why would he smile at her like she was a person instead of a problem to be managed? She noticed something else about Private Mitchell during those weeks. He always carried a letter in his breast pocket. She could see the edge of it peeking out beneath his uniform jacket. He would touch it sometimes, unconsciously, his fingers brushing the paper as if checking to make sure it was still there. He never showed it to anyone, never spoke of it, but it was clearly important, precious. A letter from a sweetheart, perhaps, a mother, a sister. She wondered what it said, wondered why he carried it so close to his heart. The answer would come sooner than she expected. The shadows outside. The first sign of trouble came in early November. Michiko was working in the vegetable garden outside the main camp fence. The autumn sun was warm on her back. The work was simple, and for a few hours, she could almost forget she was a prisoner. Then she heard shouting in the distance. A truck was passing on the access road, heading toward the nearest town. Someone in the truck bed stood up and threw something at the fence. A rock. It clattered against the barbed wire and fell into the dust. Then another rock, and another. "Go home, Japs!" a voice screamed across the distance. "You don't belong here!" More shouting, words Michiko did not fully understand, but the hatred in them needed no translation. The guards quickly herded the prisoners back inside the fence. Sergeant Frank O'Brien, a weathered career soldier who commanded the guard unit, watched the truck disappear with a grim expression on his face. That evening, Michiko heard whispers among the guards. She had learned enough English by now to catch fragments of conversation. Her ear had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the language, picking out words she recognized from the stream of unfamiliar sounds. Locals getting restless. Lost sons in the Pacific. Don't like us treating prisoners so well. The words sent a chill down her spine. She had been so focused on the kindness inside the camp that she had forgotten about the hatred outside it, forgotten that not all Americans were like Private Mitchell or Captain Harrison, forgotten that some people would never see her as anything but an enemy to be destroyed. The next morning, graffiti appeared on the fence near the main gate. Kill the Japs. The letters were painted in red, dripping down the wooden posts like blood. Michiko saw them when she walked to the infirmary. She stopped and stared, her heart pounding. Guards scrubbed the words away within hours, but the message had been received. 2 days later, Sergeant O'Brien gathered the guards for a briefing. Michiko happened to be walking past the administration building and heard fragments through an open window. Received intelligence that a group of locals is planning something. Lost family members in the war. Blaming the prisoners. Stay alert. Anyone approaching the fence without authorization is to be stopped and questioned. She hurried past, not wanting to be seen eavesdropping. That night, she lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She had survived Okinawa, survived capture, survived the voyage across the Pacific. Would she survive the hatred that lived outside these fences? Mrs. Sato, in the bunk below hers, whispered in the darkness. I heard about the sign and the rocks. Do you think they will come for us? Michiko did not know how to answer. The camp is protected, she said finally. The soldiers will keep us safe. But she was not sure she believed it. Private Mitchell seemed to sense her fear in the days that followed. He appeared more often near wherever she was working. His eyes scanned the perimeter more frequently. His hand rested on his rifle with a readiness that had not been there before. One afternoon, as she was leaving the infirmary, he fell into step beside her. Don't worry, he said quietly. We won't let anything happen to you. She looked at him, surprised by the directness. Why? She asked. The word came out before she could stop it. Why do you care? He was silent for a long moment. His hand moved to his breast pocket, touching the edge of the letter hidden there. Because I made a promise, he said. Then he walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. The letter. The revelation came on a December evening. The desert had turned cold as winter approached. Frost sparkled on the ground in the mornings. The women wore extra layers and huddled around the wood stoves in the barracks at night. Michiko had been working late in the infirmary, organizing medical supplies for an inventory Captain Harrison had requested. The building was quiet. Most patients had returned to their barracks. The only sound was the scratch of her pen on paper and the distant howl of wind across the desert. Private Mitchell appeared at the door. Captain Harrison asked me to escort you back to the barracks, he said. Getting dark, not safe to walk alone. Michiko nodded and gathered her things. They walked in silence at first. Their breath formed small clouds in the cold air. The stars were emerging overhead, impossibly bright against the darkening sky. The desert stretched away in all directions, vast and empty and ancient. She was acutely aware of him beside her, the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground, the slight fog of his breathing, the solid presence of him in the gathering dark. She knew she should not speak to him, should not encourage whatever connection seemed to be forming between them, but curiosity overwhelmed caution. The letter, she said suddenly, in your pocket. You always carry it. What is it? Private Mitchell stopped walking. For a long moment he said nothing. His hand moved to his breast pocket, pressing against the paper beneath the fabric. Then he spoke, his voice quiet and rough with emotion. My brother, he said. Tommy. He was 18, enlisted the day he turned old enough, wanted to be a hero, like in the movies. He paused, swallowed hard. He was sent to the Philippines. Luzon. His unit got ambushed in February. Most of them died right away. But Tommy held on. For 3 days he held on. Michiko felt her chest tighten. She knew this story, not the specific details, but the shape of it, the outline of loss that war carved into families everywhere. A Japanese nurse found him, Danny continued. His voice cracked slightly. She was from a field hospital nearby. The fighting had moved on. She was searching for wounded. He pulled the letter from his pocket and held it carefully, as if it were made of glass. She could have left him to die. Enemy soldier. No one would have blamed her. But she didn't. He looked at Michiko directly. His eyes were wet in the starlight. She stayed with him, he said, for 3 days. She gave him water, changed his bandages, held his hand when the pain got bad, talked to him even though he couldn't understand the words. Michiko felt tears streaming down her own face. She did not try to stop them. When he died, Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper, she wrote a letter to our family, explaining what happened, saying she was sorry she couldn't save him, saying he was brave, saying he wasn't alone at the end. He held up the letter. This was forwarded through military channels, he said, translated by someone in Washington. Took months to reach us. He looked at Michiko, his gaze intense. A Japanese nurse held my brother's hand while he died, he said. She could have walked away. She could have hated him, but she chose to be kind. He tucked the letter back into his pocket, pressing it against his heart. So when I got assigned here, he continued, and I saw you, a Japanese nurse, I thought maybe you were her, or maybe you knew her, or maybe you were just someone like her, someone who chose kindness when she could have chosen hate. Michiko was crying openly now. The tears felt hot on her cold cheeks. She understood. Finally, she understood. This young man from Iowa had lost his brother to the war, had every reason to hate Japanese people, every right to treat prisoners with cruelty or indifference. Instead, he carried a letter that reminded him of kindness, a letter that proved enemies could still be human, a letter that gave him permission to see prisoners as people instead of monsters. I cannot hate you, Danny said simply. I cannot hate any of you, because one of you saved my brother from dying alone. They stood in silence, the cold wind cutting between them, the stars blazing overhead. Michiko wanted to say something, wanted to tell him that she understood, that she had made the same choices in those final terrible months on Okinawa, that she had held the hands of dying soldiers, Japanese and American alike, because death did not care about nations or uniforms. But the words would not come. Instead, she reached out and touched his arm, just briefly, just enough to let him know she heard him, she understood. Thank you, she whispered, for telling me. Danny nodded slowly. Then he walked her the rest of the way to the barracks without another word. But everything had changed. Thanksgiving. The holiday came in late November. Michiko did not understand it at first. The guards had been talking about it for weeks. Turkey and stuffing and pumpkin pie. Words that meant nothing to her. Thanksgiving, Mrs. Sato explained. An American holiday. They give thanks for their blessings. The irony was sharp. What blessings did prisoners have to be thankful for? What gratitude could they feel while their families starved on the other side of the world? But the camp commandant had decided that prisoners would be included in the celebration. On Thanksgiving morning, the mess hall was transformed. Autumn leaves and paper decorations hung from the rafters. The tables were arranged differently, longer rows where guards and prisoners could sit together. Together. The word felt impossible. Michiko entered the mess hall with the other women. The smell hit her immediately. Roasting meat, savory herbs, something sweet baking in the ovens. A special meal had been prepared. Roasted turkey with stuffing, cranberry sauce like red jewels on the plate, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, rolls still warm from the oven with butter melting into their soft centers, and pumpkin pie for dessert, a strange orange thing that Michiko had never seen before. She was directed to a table where Private Mitchell and another guard named Corporal Davis were already seated. Her heart hammered as she sat down across from them. This was wrong. Enemies did not share meals. Prisoners did not sit with guards as equals. But here they were. Private Mitchell smiled at her across the table. Happy Thanksgiving, he said. The words meant nothing to her vocabulary, but the warmth in his voice translated perfectly. The food was placed before her, more than she had ever seen on a single plate. The turkey was golden and glistening. The smell made her dizzy with hunger and something else, something like grief. She thought of her mother and Kenji in the village near Kyoto. What were they eating today? Rice gruel if they were lucky, tree bark if they were not. Private Mitchell noticed her hesitation. It's good, he said, demonstrating by cutting a piece of turkey and putting it in his mouth. Try it. This is a real American Thanksgiving. She picked up her fork, cut a small piece of the strange meat, put it in her mouth. The flavor was unlike anything she had experienced, rich and savory with herbs she could not name. The meat was tender, falling apart on her tongue. Despite herself, she smiled. Good? Mitchell asked. Good, she confirmed. Around the mess hall, similar scenes played out. Guards and prisoners talking, laughing at jokes translated awkwardly between languages, sharing food from the same kitchen, eating at the same tables, treating each other as something other than enemies. For a few hours, the war seemed very far away. Captain Harrison stood and gave a short speech about gratitude and hope for the future. The Japanese-American translator repeated his words, and some of the prisoners wiped tears from their eyes. Michiko listened, but did not fully hear. She was watching Private Mitchell across the table, watching him eat and laugh and talk with Corporal Davis about football, whatever that was. He caught her eye and raised his coffee cup slightly, a silent toast. She raised hers in return. After the meal, as she walked back to the barracks in the cool evening air, she felt something shift inside her. This was not just about food or kindness anymore. This was about a fundamental truth that transcended nations and armies. These Americans had defeated Japan. They had every reason to be cruel, to seek revenge for Pearl Harbor, to punish prisoners for the sins of their government. Instead, they chose to share turkey and pie. They chose to treat prisoners as human beings deserving of dignity. Why? The answer came to her slowly as she walked. It was about values, about principles that went deeper than military victory. The Americans believed in certain ideas about human rights, about the treatment of prisoners, about the rules of war, and they lived by those principles even when it was difficult, even when hatred would have been easier. Japan had claimed to fight for honor and empire, but what honor was there in the things she had witnessed? The starvation of soldiers, the desperate banzai charges, the propaganda that convinced young men to die rather than surrender. The Americans had power, real power, but they used it differently than she had been taught to expect. This recognition was both liberating and terrifying. If everything she believed about the enemy was wrong, what else might be wrong? What about the war itself? What about the emperor? What about the reasons they had been given for all the suffering and death? The questions had no easy answers, but Michiko knew one thing for certain. Private Daniel Mitchell was not her enemy. He was something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to name. Hook for Part 3. But not everyone shared the camp's spirit of reconciliation. Outside the fences, in the small towns of Arizona, men with guns and grievances were making plans. Harold Brennan had lost his youngest son at Iwo Jima. The boy was 19 years old. He had been shot by Japanese soldiers on a beach of black volcanic sand and had bled to death before the medics could reach him. Harold blamed every Japanese person alive for that death, and he was not alone. In the weeks after Thanksgiving, the threats grew more frequent. More trucks driving slowly past the camp, more graffiti appearing on the fences, more rumors of angry civilians gathering in town, talking about justice, talking about revenge. December 15th was approaching, the day that would change everything. The day that Michiko would watch Private Daniel Mitchell step between a bullet and the woman he had sworn to protect. The day she would hold him as he died, his blood staining the desert sand, his last words echoing in her ears forever. You're okay. Good. Subscribe now, because what happens next will break your heart. And then piece it back together in ways you never expected. The final chapter is coming, and the hardest moments are still ahead. The gathering storm. December brought cold winds and a tension that settled over Camp Harris like frost on desert sand. The threats had been growing for weeks. More trucks driving slowly past the camp, their occupants glaring through the fence. More graffiti appearing in the night, hateful words painted in red that guards scrubbed away before most prisoners could see. More whispers among the staff about angry civilians in town, men who had lost sons and brothers in the Pacific, men who believed that kindness toward prisoners was betrayal of the dead. Sergeant Frank O'Brien doubled the guard patrols. He posted extra men at the main gate. He warned everyone to stay alert, to report anything suspicious, to be ready for trouble. The prisoners felt the change in atmosphere even if they did not fully understand it. Mrs. Sato stopped going to the garden outside the fence. Yoko refused to leave the barracks after dark. The women gathered in small groups and spoke in hushed voices about what might be coming. Michiko tried to maintain her routine. She reported to the infirmary each morning. She organized supplies. She treated patients. She pretended that everything was normal. But nothing was normal. Private Mitchell seemed to sense her fear. He appeared more often near wherever she was working. His eyes scanned the perimeter constantly. His hand rested on his rifle with a readiness that had not been there before. One evening, as she was leaving the infirmary, he fell into step beside her. "Stay close to the buildings," he said quietly. "Don't go near the fence. If you hear anything strange, anything at all, get inside and stay there." His voice was serious. His face was grim. "What is happening?" Michiko asked. He hesitated. Then he said, "There are people who want to hurt you, people who lost family in the war. They blame the prisoners." Michiko felt cold spread through her chest. "Will they come?" Mitchell looked at her directly. His blue eyes were steady. "I don't know," he said. "But if they do, I won't let them hurt you, I promise." He touched the letter in his breast pocket, the letter from the Japanese nurse who had held his brother's hand. "I made a promise to Tommy," he said. "I promised I would be the kind of person he was, the kind of person who protects people instead of hurting them. Even when it's hard, even when everyone else is choosing hate." He walked her to the barracks door. "Stay safe," he said. Then he disappeared into the darkness. Michiko lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl across the desert. She thought about her father, crushed beneath a cart of rice he had spent months growing. She thought about the soldiers on Okinawa, dying in her arms because she had no medicine to save them. She thought about her mother and Kenji, starving in a village on the other side of the world. So much loss, so much pain, and now more might be coming. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she had not spoken since childhood, a prayer to ancestors she barely remembered, a prayer for protection, for survival, for the freckled American soldier who had promised to keep her safe. December 15th. The morning of December 15th dawned clear and cold. The sky was pale blue, washed clean by overnight winds. Frost glittered on the ground like scattered diamonds. The air was crisp and sharp, the kind of cold that made breathing feel like drinking ice water. Michiko woke early and dressed quickly. She had been assigned to a work detail outside the camp fence. A storage shed about a quarter-mile from the main camp needed to be cleaned and reorganized. 6 women were selected for the job. She did not want to go. The shed was far from the protection of the main camp, far from the guard towers, far from help if something went wrong. But prisoners did not refuse work assignments. Prisoners did what they were told. Private Mitchell and Private Thompson were assigned as escorts. Michiko felt relief when she saw Mitchell waiting by the gate. He nodded to her as she joined the group of women. "Stay close," he said quietly. "We'll be back by noon." They walked the quarter-mile to the storage shed in silence. The desert stretched away in all directions, brown and flat and empty. Guard towers were visible in the distance, tiny shapes against the enormous sky. The shed was a simple wooden structure, painted the same light brown as the camp barracks. Inside were tools, spare parts, maintenance supplies. Everything was covered in dust from months of disuse. The work was simple: sweep out the dust, reorganize the shelves, create an inventory list. Michiko worked alongside Yoko and Mrs. Sato. The other women spread out through the shed, sorting and cleaning. Private Mitchell and Private Thompson stood guard outside, their rifles ready. The morning passed slowly. Around noon, Michiko paused to rest. She walked to the shed's small window and looked out at the desert. Private Mitchell was standing near the fence, looking toward the access road. His posture was tense, alert. Something was wrong. She was about to call out to him when she saw it. A truck on the access road, coming fast. The attack. The truck was old and battered. Civilian, not military. It bounced over the rutted road, kicking up clouds of dust behind it. Private Mitchell walked out to meet it, his rifle held across his chest. The truck did not slow down. "Halt!" Mitchell shouted, raising one hand. "Stop the vehicle!" The truck skidded to a halt about 30 yards away. Dust billowed around it, obscuring the cab for a moment. Then the doors flew open. 2 men jumped out. Both carried rifles. Both had faces twisted with hatred. Michiko recognized one of them from descriptions she had overheard. Harold Brennan, the man who had lost his son at Iwo Jima, the man who had been gathering angry civilians for weeks, talking about justice, talking about revenge. He was older, maybe 55, with gray hair and weathered skin and eyes that burned with grief turned to rage. The other man was younger, his son Carl, a veteran who had served in the Pacific and come home broken. His hands shook as he held his rifle, but his jaw was set with determination. "Jap lovers!" Harold screamed across the distance. "You protect these animals while our boys died." Private Thompson moved toward Mitchell, his own rifle ready. "Sir, you need to leave this area," Thompson called. "This is military property. We ain't leaving until we get justice," Harold shouted back. "My boy died at Iwo Jima. 19 years old, shot by these yellow devils, and you're treating them like guests." Inside the shed, the women froze. Yoko grabbed Michiko's arm. "What do we do?" "Stay down," Michiko whispered. "Stay quiet." Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were shaking. This was what she had feared since the day she arrived. This was the hatred the propaganda had promised, and it had finally come. Private Mitchell stepped forward, putting himself between the armed men in the shed. "I understand you're angry," he said. His voice was calm, steady. "But these prisoners are under military protection. They are our responsibility. You need to leave. Now." Harold Brennan's face contorted with rage. "Step aside, boy," he screamed. "This ain't your fight." "Yes, it is," Mitchell replied. His voice did not waver. His hands did not shake. "I have orders to protect these prisoners. I swore an oath. I will follow that oath." Carl Brennan swung his rifle toward Thompson, who had been trying to flank them. "Don't," Thompson warned, freezing in place. The situation was spinning out of control. Michiko could see it happening, could see the tension building toward violence, could see that someone was about to die. She thought about running, about fleeing into the desert, but her legs would not move. She was frozen, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. Inside the shed, Mrs. Sato was whispering a Buddhist prayer. Yoko was crying silently. The other women huddled together, waiting for the end. Harold Brennan raised his rifle. He aimed it at the shed. "They shouldn't have lived when our boys died," he screamed, and he fired. The choice. The crack of the rifle split the desert air like thunder. Michiko saw Private Mitchell move. She saw him dive toward the shed door, saw him throw himself between the gunmen and the women inside, saw his body twist in midair as he put himself in the path of the bullet. The second shot hit him in the chest. The impact spun him around. His rifle flew from his hands. Blood sprayed in an arc, bright red against the pale desert sky. He staggered. His hand went to the wound. Then he fell. He collapsed onto his side in the dust. Blood spread beneath him, dark and wet, soaking into the Arizona sand. Everything happened fast after that. Private Thompson fired, hitting Harold Brennan in the leg. The old man screamed and went down, clutching his thigh. Carl Brennan dropped his rifle immediately. His hands went up. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" he screamed, his voice cracking with sudden terror. Thompson kept his rifle trained on them. "On the ground! Both of you! Now!" More shots rang out in the distance. Guards from the main camp had heard the gunfire and were racing toward them. A siren began to wail, the sound cutting across the desert like a knife. But Michiko was not thinking about any of that. She ran from the shed. She ran to the man who had taken a bullet for her. The last words. Michiko fell to her knees beside him. Private Mitchell lay on his back in the dust. His eyes were open, staring at the endless blue sky. Blood poured from the wound in his chest, spreading in a dark pool beneath him. She pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to save him the way she had tried to save so many others. But there was so much blood, too much blood. "Mitchell!" she shouted, her voice breaking. "Danny, stay with me!" He turned his head slightly. His eyes found her face. And despite everything, despite the pain and the blood and the death that was coming for him, he smiled. That same simple smile. The smile that had confused her on the first day. The smile that had cracked the walls around her heart. "You're okay," he whispered. His voice was weak, fading. "Don't talk," Michiko said. Tears streamed down her face. "Help is coming. You'll be okay. You have to be okay." But she was a nurse. She knew what a chest wound looked like. She knew what it meant when blood bubbled from the lips, when breathing became shallow and labored, when the light in someone's eyes began to dim. He was dying, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Tell my mom," Danny gasped. His hand reached up, trembling, and touched her arm. "Tell her, I did my job, kept my promise, protected innocent people." "You did," Michiko sobbed. "You saved us. You saved me." His fingers tightened on her arm. "Just for a moment. Not demons," he whispered. "Just people." Tommy knew. I knew too. From the start. His eyes moved to her face, held her gaze. "Same sky," he said. "Same people. Just different countries." His hand fell from her arm. His chest stopped moving. His eyes stayed open, but the light in them was gone. Private Daniel Mitchell, 21 years old, farm boy from Iowa, who had never fired his rifle at another human being, who had carried a letter from a Japanese nurse in his breast pocket because it reminded him that enemies could still be kind. He died in the Arizona desert with his head in the lap of a Japanese prisoner he had sworn to protect. He died because he stepped forward when everyone else would have stepped aside. Michiko held him and screamed. The sound tore from somewhere deep inside her, a place where all the grief and loss and confusion of the past months lived. A sound that carried across the desert and echoed off the distant mountains. Guards surrounded them. Hands pulled her away from the body. Medical personnel arrived, but there was nothing they could do. The two Brennans were arrested, dragged to their feet, handcuffed, and hauled away to face murder charges. But none of it mattered. Danny was gone. The boy who smiled at strangers was gone, and the world felt darker for his absence. The funeral. The camp went into lockdown after the shooting. News spread quickly. The incident made headlines across the country. Army guard dies protecting Japanese prisoners. The story was picked up by newspapers from coast to coast. Some praised Mitchell as a hero. Others questioned why an American soldier would sacrifice himself for the enemy. Letters poured into the camp, some expressing sympathy, others expressing outrage. Michiko heard none of it. She spent 3 days in the infirmary, treated for shock. She could not eat, could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Danny falling, saw the blood spreading across his chest, heard his last words echoing in the darkness. "You're okay." "Good." Captain Harrison stayed with her, talking quietly, making sure she drank water and took small bites of food. "He was a good man," Captain Harrison said. "He believed in doing what was right, even when it was hard, even when everyone else chose differently." "He died for me," Michiko whispered. "I am the enemy." "Why would he do that?" "Because you're not the enemy," Captain Harrison replied gently. "Not to him. To him, you were just a person who needed protecting. That's who Danny was. That's the choice he made." The funeral was held on a cold December morning. The entire camp attended. Guards in dress uniforms, prisoners in their cleanest clothes. Even the commandant, Colonel Patterson, stood at attention. Private Mitchell's body lay in a flag-draped coffin. His fellow guards served as pallbearers. They carried him slowly across the parade ground to where a military chaplain waited. The chaplain spoke about duty and honor and sacrifice, about the better angels of our nature, about the courage it took to protect the vulnerable, even when the vulnerable wore the face of the enemy. Michiko stood with the other prisoners, wearing a black armband. Tears streamed down her face. She did not try to hide them. When the chaplain asked if anyone wished to speak, Michiko surprised herself by stepping forward. Her English was halting, imperfect, but she spoke from her heart. "Private Mitchell," she said, her voice trembling. "He show me kindness when I expect hate. He treat me like human when I am prisoner. He die protecting me. Enemy person." She paused, gathered herself. "I will never forget. I carry his sacrifice all my life. He teach me. People can be good, even in war. Even to enemy." She bowed deeply, the Japanese gesture of ultimate respect. Then she returned to her place among the prisoners. After the ceremony, as the coffin was carried away, Michiko felt something shift inside her. She understood now why Danny had smiled at her that first day, why he had brought her coffee and held doors and walked her through the rain. It was not pity, it was not guilt. It was a choice to see her as a person instead of an enemy, a choice to honor his brother's memory by being kind, a choice that had cost him everything, and she would honor that choice for the rest of her life. The letter that evening, Michiko sat down to write a letter. It took her a week to compose. Nurse Patterson helped her with the English, correcting grammar and spelling, but the words were all Michiko's. Dear Mrs. Mitchell, my name is Michiko Hayashi. I was a prisoner at the camp where your son served. I am writing to tell you that your son was a hero. He died protecting me and other prisoners from men who wanted to kill us. He did not have to do this. We were the enemy. We were the people his country had fought against, but he saw us as human beings who deserved protection. Your son was kind to me from my first day at the camp. He smiled when no one else smiled. He brought me coffee when I worked late. He walked me through the rain with an umbrella. He treated me with dignity when he could have treated me with hate. He told me about Tommy, about the letter from the Japanese nurse who stayed with him at the end. I think that letter changed your son. I think it taught him that enemies can still be human. That kindness can exist even in war. Because of your son, I learned that too. I am sorry I cannot give you back your son. I am sorry that he died protecting someone like me. But please know that his sacrifice was not in vain. He changed my life. He changed how I see the world. He showed me that there is still good in people, even when everything seems dark. I will remember him always. I will tell my children and grandchildren about the American soldier who died protecting a Japanese prisoner. His name will live on in my family forever. With deepest respect and sorrow, Michiko Hayashi. She gave the letter to Captain Harrison, who promised to ensure it reached Danny's mother. Whether she would receive a reply, Michiko did not know. But she needed to write it, needed Mrs. Mitchell to know that her son had not died for nothing, that his sacrifice had meant something, that he had changed at least one life before his own was taken. The return. In March 1946, Michiko boarded a ship bound for Japan. She stood on the deck with dozens of other former prisoners, watching the American coastline fade into the distance. The same coastline she had seen when she arrived 9 months earlier, terrified and expecting death. So much had changed since then. She was not the same woman who had stepped off that train in Arizona. That woman had been broken by war, emptied of hope, waiting to die. This woman was something else, something rebuilt from the ashes of everything she had believed. The voyage took 2 weeks. The seas were rough, but Michiko barely noticed. She spent most of her time on deck, staring at the endless Pacific, thinking about everything that had happened. When the ship finally entered Tokyo Bay, she saw the devastation for the first time. The city was flattened, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash and rubble. Buildings that had stood for centuries were gone, replaced by fields of debris and makeshift shelters. This was what defeat looked like. Michiko made her way to her village near Kyoto. The trains were running again, but slowly, and the journey took 3 days. When she finally walked up the path to her family's house, her mother came running out. Fumiko had aged a decade in the 2 years since Michiko had last seen her. Her hair was white now. Her face was thin. Her eyes were hollow. But when she saw her daughter, those eyes filled with tears. They held each other in the doorway and wept. That night, sitting around the low table in their small house, Michiko told her family about the camp, about the food and the medical work, about the kindness of some guards, and she told them about Private Daniel Mitchell. She told them about the letter he carried, about the Japanese nurse who had comforted his dying brother, about the choice he made to be kind when hatred would have been easier. She told them how he died, stepping forward instead of aside, putting himself between bullets and prisoners, saving her life with his own. Her mother listened in silence. When Michiko finished, Fumiko reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "The war taught us to hate," she said quietly, "but this American soldier taught you something else. That is a gift worth carrying." Kenji, now 19 years old, had survived the war. He had been conscripted in the final months but never shipped overseas. He sat beside Michiko and listened to everything she said. "I want to draw him," he said when she finished. "The American. Can you describe his face?" Michiko closed her eyes and saw Danny's smile. The freckles, the sandy hair, the eyes that had looked at her like she was a person instead of an enemy. Yes, she said, I can. 50 years later, in 1995, Michiko Hayashi returned to America. She was 73 years old. Her hair was white, her face was lined with decades of living, but her eyes were still sharp, still held the determination that had carried her through war and captivity and loss. She had built a good life in the years since the war. She had worked as a nurse in Tokyo, helping rebuild the country's shattered medical system. She had married a school teacher named Takeshi, a gentleman who reminded her sometimes of Danny. She had raised 3 children and watched them have children of their own, but she had never forgotten Private Daniel Mitchell. She had told his story to her children, to her grandchildren, to anyone who would listen. The story of the American soldier who chose kindness when hatred would have been easier, who stepped forward when everyone else stepped aside. Now finally she had come to see where he was buried. The Mitchell family farm was outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Rolling hills covered with corn, a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a red barn in the distance. It looked exactly like she had imagined from Danny's stories about his childhood. She found his grave in a small cemetery beside a country church, a simple headstone, white marble, inscribed with words that made her weep. Private Daniel Mitchell, 1924 to 1945. He chose kindness. Michiko knelt beside the headstone. She placed flowers she had carried all the way from Japan, cherry blossoms dried and pressed from a tree near her village. The same kind of blossoms her father had read poetry about when she was a child. She spoke to him in Japanese first, then in English. I kept my promise, Danny. I told everyone about you. My children know your name. My grandchildren know your story. She touched the cold stone. You asked me to tell your mother you did your job, that you kept your promise, that you protected innocent people. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face. You did, Danny. You did. She stayed at the grave for a long time, remembering the young man with freckles and a gentle smile, remembering the coffee he brought her, the umbrella in the rain, the letter he carried in his breast pocket, remembering the moment he stepped forward. When she finally stood to leave, she whispered one last thing. Same sky, Danny. Different countries, but the same sky. She looked up at the vast blue dome overhead, the same sky that stretched over Japan, the same sky that had witnessed his sacrifice 50 years ago. And you made it a little bit better. The message, Private Daniel Mitchell could have stepped aside. He could have let the angry civilians have their revenge. No one would have blamed him. These were enemy prisoners, representatives of a nation that had killed thousands of Americans, that had killed his own brother. But he did not step aside. He stepped forward. He put himself between the guns and the women he had sworn to protect. He paid for that choice with his life. The bullet that killed him became more than an act of violence. It became a testament to something greater, the belief that all people, even enemies, deserve protection. The conviction that kindness is not weakness, but the truest form of strength. The understanding that our choices define us more than our circumstances ever could. For Michiko Hayashi, that moment in the Arizona desert became the defining event of her life. She had arrived at the camp expecting torture and death. She had been prepared to die with hatred in her heart. Instead, she found kindness from unexpected sources. And when death came, it came for her protector, not for her. She carried his story for the rest of her days. As she told her grandson decades later, holding the faded photograph of a freckled young man in an army uniform. He showed me that people are not defined by their nations or their uniforms. We are defined by our choices, and he chose to be a hero. That is the story worth remembering. The story of how one moment of sacrifice bridged the divide between enemy nations. The story of how kindness can exist even in the darkest chapters of history. The story of a farm boy from Iowa who stepped forward when everyone else stepped aside. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful true stories from World War II. These accounts remind us that even in history's darkest chapters, individual acts of courage and kindness can light the way forward. Thank you for watching. And remember, the past teaches us, but we choose what lessons to carry into the future. He could have stepped aside, but he stepped forward, and that made all the difference.